Good morning, church. We're in the children's wing. Did you know we had a children's wing? Who knew? We actually have a whole wing dedicated to our children at this church. It's really a cool place for our kids to do a lot of really cool things. And I know that our kids and our volunteers have been missing this place during this whole COVID-19 pandemic that's been going on. But again, it's one of those cool places. And I wanted to be in here for this sermon today because I immediately thought about a song that many of us sang when we were younger. And I'm sure that there's probably a newer version of this song that our kids sing that's probably got a little different feel to it. But it's This Little Light of Mine, right? This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. And then we do this one that's really cool that all the kids like, right? Hide it under a bushel. No! I'm gonna let it shine. And that was always one of the best parts of the song for me because what kid didn't want to take advantage of the opportunity to scream in church? And that lets you scream in church. And so this idea that we are lights, and this song is taken directly from the lips of Jesus. So in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is talking to followers, and he says these words. He says, "You are the light of the world. A city that's built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but rather on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." Now, John tells us in his gospel that Jesus refers to himself as the light of the world. He says there, Jesus spoke to them saying, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." But in Matthew, it's not Jesus who is the light of the world, but rather Jesus calls his followers lights of the world. He says, "You are the light of the world." And he goes on and he says that no one lights a lamp and then hides it under some basket or some bushel, right? What would be the point of doing that? Why light a lamp and hide it under something? That's not why you light a lamp. Now, a little side note, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but who's lighting this lamp? I get the impression it's Jesus, that the reason we are the light of the world is because Jesus has lit us. Jesus has set us aflame, like we are his lamps. And he has lit this lamp. And Jesus says, "I have no intentions of hiding you. I have no intentions of lighting you as my lamp and then hiding you under a bushel basket so that people can't see you. But rather, the reason I light you is so that I can set you atop the lampstand and you can give light to all that is around you. So that all that are around you in your community, your neighborhoods, wherever you are, so that they can actually see you." So Jesus says, "I do not light you as lights of this world to be hidden under a bushel basket, but rather I want you to be seen." So I think this would be maybe a good discussion time in this sermon. What are some ways that we can be guilty of hiding our light under a bushel basket? What are some ways that we can be guilty of being the light, being Jesus's light, and hiding ourselves under a bushel basket? Why don't you spend a little time talking about that and then come back? Okay, so did anyone suggest that one of the ways that we might actually hide ourselves as lights under a bushel basket is by being in the box? Right? We've started this sermon series last week called Church Outside the Box, and that box is the imagery of our church buildings. And I don't really think it's fair to say it's simply just about our church buildings, but it's about It's about this idea of confining our expressions of discipleship to a worship gathering, a public worship gathering inside a church building, right? That we have this misconception that the crux of Christianity, that the very center of our Christianity and our discipleship is going to church. Right? Being inside a building, gathering together, participating in some acts of worship, right? Singing songs together and taking communion together and hearing a sermon and praying together. I think if we truly believe that our discipleship is best expressed and summarized by what we do for 2 hours on Sunday mornings inside a building, then maybe we have actually been guilty of hiding ourselves as lights under a bushel basket. Because I'm not real sure that is at the very center of our discipleship, that is the very crux of what we do. See, discipleship, at its very core, discipleship can be summarized in 3 words. Right? Are you ready for this? This is Discipleship 101, and it's summarized in 3 words. Come, follow me. This was Jesus' invitation to everyone that he came across. Come, follow me. And this is the way that you can summarize discipleship. That is Discipleship 101. And so let's break this down, okay? Let's look at these words. And so, come. You have to leave where you are. You have to move. You can't stay where you are. You can't remain as you are. And honestly, this never ends. If you ever get to a point that you've arrived, if you ever get to a point where you think there's nothing else for you to learn, if you ever get to a point where you think there's nothing to change or nothing to improve on, then you are no longer living into the very first word of Discipleship 101, which is come, right? It's a constant movement. We are constantly moving. We're constantly moving into the direction of Jesus. He says, come. Second word, follow. You have to be willing to let someone else lead the way, right? No one is truly ready for leadership until they have really learned what it means to follow, right? And we live in a world that says you're either a follower or a leader, as if one or the other. But in the kingdom of God, it's not that way, right? Really bad leaders were probably really bad followers to begin with. And so we need to come. We've got to leave where we are. We can't remain. And then we have to follow. We have to be willing to let someone else take the lead, and we need to follow me. Come, follow, and that third word is me. You have to know who it is that you're following, right? And the me here is very clear. The me here is Jesus. The me that we are to follow is Jesus. I once heard someone accuse evangelical Christians of being way more familiar with Paul than they are with Jesus, right? That we spend more time in Romans and Ephesians than we do in Luke or John. Now, I love the Bible, and I am a Bible student, and I love to teach the Bible, and I think there's nothing wrong with Romans and Ephesians. I think there's nothing wrong with Paul or Peter or James, but we always need to remember that their source is Jesus. That they are always reflecting on the life and the teachings of Jesus, because Jesus is the me that we are to follow. We follow Jesus. We tell people about Jesus. We try to live like Jesus. And so we need to be listening to the very voice of Jesus. There's a passage in John 10 and verse 27 where Jesus says, "My sheep hear my voice. I know them and they follow me." I love that. My sheep hear my voice. So, another discussion time. What does Jesus mean when he says, "My sheep hear my voice"? What do you think he means when he says that? Spend some time talking about that for a little bit. Okay, so Dennis in his communion comments referenced the Sermon on the Mount, which I thought was great because I was going to be talking about that in my sermon. And we didn't plan that. That's just the way the Spirit works sometimes. And over again in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus will say things like, "You have heard that it was said," and then he'll tell them what they've heard it said before, and then he will go on to say, "But now I am saying," right? You have heard that it was once said, and he's always reflecting on that old law, right? And so he'll say something like, "You have heard that it was said, 'Do not murder,'" right? And that's exactly what it said, right? The old law said, "Don't murder." But then Jesus goes, "But listen to me now, because now I'm saying, don't even hate." Right? And he does this over and over and over again in the Sermon on the Mount. "You have heard that it was said this, but now I'm telling you this. You have heard that it was said this, but now I am telling you this," over and over and over again. And then he gets at the very end of that Sermon on the Mount, and he wraps everything up by saying this: "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on a rock." Everyone who hears these words of mine, he says. You've heard that it was said, but now I'm talking. Listen to me. My sheep hear my voice and know my voice. Are we listening to Jesus? Are we learning from Jesus? Are we trying to live like Jesus? There's actually 3 more words right there that could summarize or be an equivalent to that discipleship 101. So Jesus says, "Come, follow me." We could also put in those words, listen, learn, live, right? Come, listen, follow, learn, me. That's the life we live. And so we listen, we learn, we live. And so discipleship can be summarized as "come, follow me." Discipleship could be equally summarized as listen, learn, and live, right? To come to Jesus is to listen to him. To follow Jesus is to learn from him. And the me part is to truly live like him. And so again, I ask, are we listening to Jesus? Are we listening to his voice? Are we learning from Jesus? Are we trying to live like Jesus? I want to issue a challenge right now. For the next week, starting today, for an entire week, and that's not very long. I actually should challenge you to do this longer, but let's start with baby steps. For the next week, every day, read the Sermon on the Mount. It's just 3 chapters. It's Matthew chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7. If you're unfamiliar with the Bible, Matthew is the very first book of the New Testament. And then look at chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7. That entire section, those 3 chapters, is the Sermon on the Mount. And I want to challenge all of us today to start today and go for the entire week. And if you want to go further, I think that would be awesome. But at least for the next week, every single day, read those 3 chapters. Listen to Jesus, learn from Jesus, and try to live like Jesus. And here's what you're going to discover if you already aren't familiar, if you're not already familiar with the Sermon on the Mount. Here's what you are going to discover is that when you follow Jesus for very long, you'll start to notice that he doesn't teach us how to do church. Right? You follow Jesus for very long and you learn that he doesn't really spend a whole lot of time teaching us how to properly conduct a worship service, right? We don't follow him and end up at a church building. I think this is one of the reasons that we probably get accused of being more familiar with Paul than we are with Jesus, especially in the Restoration movement, which is the heritage of our church. Now, if you're not familiar with the Restoration Movement, we've been a movement that was very focused on, and we still are in many ways, very focused on getting church right. And what I mean by getting church right is getting the 2 hours that we gather together on a Sunday morning in our buildings, getting that right. We've been very serious about Sunday mornings. Our history has been consumed with cans and can'ts. Can we do this? And why can't we do that? And we can't do this, but we can do that. And talking about instrumental music versus a cappella music, or how often can you take the communion, or how often should you take communion, or who can speak and who can't speak. And we just get so wrapped up in this hour and a half, 2 hours that we spend together on Sunday mornings. Is this authorized? Is this unauthorized? And the thing is, Jesus doesn't talk about those things, which is why we spend a lot of time with Paul. Because Paul seems to talk about a lot of those things, although I would argue that he's probably not talking about that as much as we think he is. But he does talk about it a little more than Jesus does. And so we, especially in our heritage, we spend a lot of time in Paul. But when you follow Jesus, when you listen to his voice and you spend time with him, especially as you spend time in the Sermon on the Mount, like I've challenged you to do, when you follow Jesus, you end up walking the streets with him. When you follow Jesus, you end up sitting alongside of him as he dines with other people. When you follow Jesus, you end up finding a nice spot in the shade as Jesus teaches the crowds by a beach or by a mountainside. And what Jesus does is he teaches us how to serve others, and he teaches us how to bless others, and he teaches us how to truly be in relationship with others. And you're going to discover all of this as you spend this next week in the Sermon on the Mount. You're going to discover that that's what Jesus really spends his time talking about. So we need to listen to his voice. We need to learn from him, and we need to live like him. We need to come follow me, he says. So, according to most scholars and historians, the very earliest Christians were probably known better collectively as a group. They were probably known as the Way. More so than being called Christians. And actually, Christian, from what we can tell, started out as a derogatory term for them. But more so than being called Christians or being called the church, they were known as a group that went by the name The Way. The Way. In the book of Acts, they're actually referred to as The Way 5 different times. That's what this group of Jesus followers is called. And so, another discussion moment, okay? Why do you think the early church was known as the Way? How did they come about that name? Spend some time talking about why you think that is. Okay, so one of the more well-known reasons why they probably went by the name The Way is because Jesus himself in John's Gospel refers to himself as the Way. And so he says in John 14 and verse 6, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And so most people, when they think about the church being called the Way and trying to figure out why that is, they immediately go to this John 14 passage and they say they're called the Way because Jesus called himself the Way and they're following him. There's another reason that is given, and it actually is given very, very early on by some very early church fathers, and it's one of the reasons that a lot of us don't really think about. But a lot of the very early church fathers believed that the church took on the name The Way, not just because Jesus called himself the Way, but because Jesus did most of his teachings along the way. Does that make sense? In other words, some early church fathers said that Jesus taught his disciples as he was walking the streets through the cities and the towns. And they said that what Jesus was doing was that he was showing people the way of life that God envisioned for his people as he walked along the way. And so for many of these early church fathers, they believed that the essence of Christianity was best expressed along the way. Does that make sense? That the very essence of our discipleship was best expressed not in how we worship or acts of worship or in our corporate gatherings, but rather that the very essence of our discipleship was best expressed along the way. As we listen to Jesus, as we learn from Jesus, and as we try to live the life of Jesus, right? As we interact with others in our neighborhoods, in our communities, as we come across stranger, as we deal with our neighbors to our right and our left, that is the way that we best express our discipleship, is in how we listen, learn, and then live. That the very essence of discipleship is best expressed in come, follow me. That we live the life of Jesus in this world and we reflect who he is to everyone around. That we do not put our lights under the bushel, right? We do not hide behind closed doors. We do not confine our expressions of discipleship to an hour and a half worship service on Sunday mornings, but rather we get out in this community. We listen to Jesus, we learn from Jesus, and we live Jesus. And again, church, this is church outside the box.